Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello and welcome. I'm Jeffrey Mishlove. Today we'll be exploring postmodern philosophy. With me is philosopher Reza Jorjani, who is the author of several books, including Prometheus and Atlas, World, State of Emergency, Lovers of Sophia, and novel Folklore. Welcome, Jason.
Good to be with you again, Jeffrey.
Yes, it is. It's a pleasure to be with you, a postmodern philosopher. I've always been conflicted about postmodern philosophy. There's something about it that has irritated me, I have to say, ever since I first encountered it. And I know it's a very dominant movement. I once ran into a university professor who proudly proclaimed, in the name of postmodern philosophy, this is the bedrock truth.
Well, that's a rather ironic statement.
Isn't it?
I mean, because postmodern philosophy begins with the denial of any bedrock, and particularly with the bedrock of the modern European Enlightenment. So, not too long ago, there was this article in Jacobin magazine, which described me as the epitome of what's wrong with postmodern philosophy. And the article made all kinds of extremely superficial and questionable claims, but I would say its main contention is actually correct. Not necessarily that I'm the problem with postmodern philosophy or that I epitomize what's wrong with it, but certainly that I am a defining postmodern thinker. I would affirm that. But like yourself, I have a lot of frustrations with the prevailing currents in postmodern thought. And I think that the issue is that postmodern thinkers have distanced themselves too greatly from the grandfather and father of postmodernity, namely Nietzsche and Heidegger.
Well, the fundamental idea of postmodernism is often referred to as deconstruction. Let's define that term.
Well, the term comes from Martin Heidegger. The second half of Being in Time, which was never published, was supposed to be a deconstruction of the history of ontology, going through the milestone thinkers in the Western canon, from Aristotle to Descartes to Kant. And the term in the original German is Abbau, which means dismantling. It's bauen, to build, so it's the unbuilding or dismantling of a structure.
Which actually would seem to me to be the essence of philosophy itself, which is questioning your assumptions.
It's certainly true to the Socratic method. And I would also say that it's true to Heraclitus's mode of thinking, which is an inspiration to Friedrich Nietzsche, who I would argue is the grandfather of postmodern philosophy. If Heidegger is its father, Nietzsche is its grandfather. Nietzsche, of course, already was leveling a critique at the entire history of Western metaphysics from Plato onwards. And he used terms like dynamite, to describe the destruction of the foundations of Western ontology. And in particular, he had this notion of the will to truth ultimately reversing itself and recognizing that art is more valuable than truth.
Yeah, see, I guess that's where I've had some problems myself, because it's always seemed to me that while deconstruction, questioning our assumptions, is useful, maybe even more useful is the quest for eternal truths.
Well, a core, it's actually, I hesitate to say core idea, because the concept of core and essence and centrality is partly what's been subjected to intense question by postmodern thinkers. But central to postmodern thought is this idea of différance that Jacques Derrida has developed from out of the thought of Martin Heidegger. In Heidegger's works, this is referred to as the ontological difference, which is the difference between being as such, or being in itself on the one hand, and beings or entities on the other hand. And the idea here is that various beings, entities in the world, all lack any inherent essence because they defer to one another insofar as we're able to delineate them at all. Nothing is lacking in a context. Everything is part of a certain hermeneutic context, a certain circle of understanding.
Everything is sort of interlocked.
Interdependent in a way where no being has any inherent and abiding essence that's lacking in context. Okay, and that would allow that being to be subsistent without others.
In and of itself.
Right, so everything arises in a conditioned manner, and in a historically conditioned manner. The only essence that beings have is being in itself, but being is no thing. Heidegger makes a big deal out of this, that in his essay Science and Reflection, that the problem with Western scientific rationality is that it doesn't recognize that being itself is no thing. And this idea of being as nothingness, which means that all beings lack any inherent essence, is paralleled in the Buddhist idea of shunyata. And so, yes, it is the case that for postmoderns there are no eternal truths. There is no Platonic realm of abstract and abiding forms. The critique of that metaphysics, which has had many permutations in the history of Western ontology, the critique of that metaphysics begins with Nietzsche, and it's radicalized by Heidegger.
And the philosophy of the Enlightenment suggests otherwise, that we live in a rational universe.
Yes, I would say, and I think Heidegger also did think, although this is somewhat oversimplifying matters, but I would say it's fair to argue that Heidegger saw Kant's abstract ideas as another form of idealism in the vein of Platonic idealism. Although on the other side of the fulcrum of Descartes, who made the subject so central to cosmology and ontology. So the deconstruction of these abstract principles is a main theme in postmodern thought.
Now let's talk about the relationship between postmodern philosophy and Marxism, because when I was in the School of Criminology at Berkeley and studied sociology, it seemed very clear that the whole discipline of sociology had been infiltrated by the Marxists, who were using the postmodern methodologies to try and deconstruct all of the institutions of the capitalist society with the view in mind, I suppose, ultimately of subverting them. And this was so threatening that at the time, Ronald Reagan actually canceled the entire School of Criminology at Berkeley while I was a student there.
Well, this is a really important point, because you see what happened is after the Second World War, after 1945, because of the way in which Nietzsche had been appropriated by the Nazis, and because of Heidegger's direct affiliation with the Nazi Party at a high level, people who were successors of Nietzsche and Heidegger, in France in particular, had psychological issues. I'd say some kind of deep guilt that they tried to deal with in terms of their debt to Nietzsche and Heidegger. And so they attempted to reappropriate and adapt ideas from Marx as an antidote to what they considered some of the more right-wing elements in the thought of Nietzsche and Heidegger, or at least elements in their philosophy that could be co-opted by totalitarian regimes. So they attempted to rework Marx in a way that could be synthesized with Heidegger. And we see this both in Michel Foucault and in Jacques Derrida. And I'd like to say a few things about each of them, because they're relevant to how I've developed my own ideas, beginning with Prometheus and Atlas.
Now, I'm guessing that most of our viewers have heard of neither Foucault nor Derrida, but I know that they are two of the most prominent postmodern philosophers of the 20th and perhaps 21st century.
That's right. One of the main ideas in Foucault's work that I adopt, and that becomes a point of departure for my work in Prometheus and Atlas, is the idea that all theoretical frameworks, all systems of knowledge, are also regimes of power, that power and knowledge are inextricable. And of course, Foucault is getting this right out of Nietzsche. It's the idea of the will to power, and of the idea that the will to truth is a permutation of the will to power, and the will to power in a disguised form. Foucault also develops from out of Heidegger the idea of the institutional character of all systems of knowledge, that there are overall theoretical frameworks, or what Thomas Kuhn calls paradigms, that implicitly condition the kinds of questions asked and the way in which certain research projects proceed. And these methodologies are institutionalized. They are embedded in and reinforced by institutions, which are, of course, power structures. And these institutions produce a certain form of subjectivity. It's not as if the human subject, the individual, is being oppressed by these institutions. That would be a very modern Enlightenment way of looking at it. Foucault argues, coming out of Heidegger, that subjectivity itself is produced by these institutions in different ways. This is Heidegger's idea of the Gestell, or framework, the inframing network of modern institutional research science, which always gets certain answers out of nature because it only knows to ask particular questions. In other words, it is getting the answers that it wants out of nature by framing questions in certain ways based on institutional interests. So I adopt those ideas from Foucault. And they do have origins in Nietzsche and Heidegger. But then you see Foucault appropriating elements of Marx insofar as his entire critique of various institutionalized forms of knowledge, for example, the criminal justice system, in his book Discipline and Punish. His entire critique there is a negative critique. He has no positive vision of what should replace these institutions, or of what should replace the form of subjectivity characteristic of the modern age. So this is what Nietzsche calls a purely critical history, that's interested in exposing all of our systems of knowledge as expressions of certain oppressive power relations. And, you know, this was characteristic of the Marxists in general.
In other words, not just Marxists, but now it's been taken up by feminists as well. They're basically saying everything you think is original to you is actually conditioned by your support of the capitalist patriarchal power structure in which you operate, is sort of the critique.
Yes, and you know, the deeper critique of the construction of subjectivity and the power relations that condition all systems of knowledge that you see in a work like The Archaeology of Knowledge by Michel Foucault, that deeper critique that's still close to Heidegger and close to Nietzsche could bring you to very different conclusions than the ones that some of these more superficial second and third rate postmodern thinkers have arrived at. The other person I'd like to talk about is Jacques Derrida.
Okay.
And I had mentioned already that Derrida develops this idea of différance from out of Heidegger, and that it's similar to the ontological or epistemological anarchism that we see in Buddhism. Derrida writes a book on Marx called Specters of Marks. And this book actually deeply influenced me. And you can see this in an essay that I've included in Lovers of Sophia, an essay called Prisoners of Property and Propriety. And this essay was written before Prometheus and Atlas, a few years before Prometheus and Atlas. And anyone who reads it will realize that it is the developmental matrix for the idea of the spectral revolution.
Okay. Which is a very unique concept you've developed, about which we have a separate interview. And just for readers who really want to dig into it, I'm going to post a link right now in the upper right of their screen. They could link to the Spectral Revolution interview.
So this term specter is one that was made famous by Marx in the Communist Manifesto, the specter that's haunting Europe, the specter of communism. And Jacques Derrida in Specters of Marks tries to retrieve the spectral promise of Marxism on the far side of the failure of the Soviet communist project. And so he takes a more ontological look at Marx. Mm-hmm. And I've taken my own, ontological look at Marx, both before and after I read Derrida. And in particular, in the work of the young Marx and the economic and philosophic manuscripts of 1844, in the thought of a Marx that's coming right out of Hegel, you see that Marx is really concerned with the alienation of humanity from nature, in the sense that he sees the natural world, the physical world, as, in a way, a projection of the human unconscious. And he discusses the manner in which the relationship between man and woman in the property-holding system of the modern industrial period epitomizes the dysfunctional alienation of man from nature.
And I've always thought that was one of Marx's best arguments.
And it's one that I actually adopt in various esoteric ways throughout many of the books I've written, including, in fact, my latest work, novel Folklore, where I discuss the Mazdakite communistic movement in Iran, which was also a mystical movement.
Right. Hundreds of years before Marx.
Yes. Well, interestingly, though, their symbol was the red flag, which was adopted by the Communist International. And the Mazdakite movement was a mystical movement. And I would argue that the young Marx is a mystic. In his letters to his girlfriend, the young Karl Marx has all these very, very poetic passages. He embeds poems into his letters to his girlfriend, Jenny. And he goes on and on about Prometheus as the great saint and martyr of philosophy, and as the hero of human liberation. So
Prometheus, the Greek titan who stole fire from the gods to give it to humanity.
Prometheus, the rebel against the Olympian world order, and the champion of human self-determination. And it's also worth noting, I have to say, that, and it's interesting how few people have observed this, the crescent and the star were symbols of Prometheus. And if you look at the flag of the Soviet Union, and it's on a red background, which suggests fire as well. It's interesting, because the star there is the planet Venus, which was referred to in the guise of the morning star as Lucifer. At any rate, be that as it may, when you look at this essay, Prisoners of Property and Propriety, you see that my concept of the spectral revolution and my identification of the archetype of Prometheus as the archetype of humans striving for self-determination through the power of science and technology are ideas that were developed in dialogue with Marx. And also through Derrida's reading of Marx, which emphasizes this idea of the spectral in Marx's thought.
Well, Marx used the spectral in a political way, talking about the specter of communism.
But the point is, it's not fundamentally political. It's only derivatively political. Marx is, the majority of his writing is on economics and politics.
Right.
But Marx, at his deepest level, is an ontological thinker, and his ontology has to do with the issue of human alienation. And this brings him very close to Heidegger. So it wasn't all that difficult for postmodern thinkers like Foucault and Derrida, or even, say, Herbert Marcuse in his attempt to develop what he called a Heidegger Marxismus, to synthesize Heidegger and Marx, because they're grappling with some of the same problems of human existence.
Well, as a parapsychologist, it strikes me that our alienation from nature, the way in which women are oppressed in our society, the way in which many workers are alienated from their own work, although I think less so perhaps today than in Marx's age, all is suggestive to me of a climate in which we're alienated from the depths of our own psyche.
That's right. And it even becomes a question of what our own psyche is. In the title of that essay, Prisoners of Property and Propriety, it's propriety also in the French sense, propriété, or what is propre, what is proper to oneself.
Yeah.
In other words, to be a property holder in the modern Enlightenment conception, of the natural rights of man, including the right to private property, you first have to have a concept of what is proper to yourself.
Yeah.
Right, of what define the limits of your selfhood, your subjectivity as compared to another person. And so the upshot of that essay is actually a deconstruction of the persona through an analysis of the way that memory and thought function robotically to reinforce certain social expectations and to construct our personality for us in an unconscious way that's actually ultimately oppressive.
And so many people, when you ask them, as parapsychologists sometimes do, have you had psychic experiences? We have a situation where the higher people are up on institutional hierarchies, the less likely they are to acknowledge psychic experiences that are common in the general population until they get maybe to the very top.
That's right, and you've made a point to me that the psychop people, who are the greatest bane of the parapsychology research community in general, embody this modern scientific rationality of the Enlightenment, which these critics of mine in Jacobin want us to return to. But this same modern scientific rationality is what's responsible for the devastating alienation of man, say, from the ecological system of the Earth.
Skeptics of parapsychology will sometimes say, we don't care what empirical evidence you have, it contradicts a rational view of the universe, and therefore it must be wrong. In fact, I'll tell you this, the people who wrote that article about you in the Jacobin magazine, I thought they had an interesting argument in favor of Enlightenment philosophy. I invited them to be on this program, but they said, well, we don't know because Jorjani seems to be involved in parapsychology. And I said to them, parapsychology can be justified according to rational principles. That's what parapsychologists do science for, to show that using the scientific method, this empirical evidence exists. And at that point, the conversation ended because they didn't want to go any further with that. They had nothing to say, and they just simply want to disagree. And that's, to me, it's very unfortunate that the so-called rationalists, who I admire in many ways, take that point of view.
Yes, and it's also terribly disingenuous, because one of the things these individuals argued is that we need to return to the Socratic method in education. And that defined my teaching. Anyone who was in my classrooms would remember that I really adopted the Socratic method. I was intensely interested in engaging with counter-arguments and a variety of perspectives, and taking positions entirely out of devil's advocacy to see where an interesting argument might lead. And that's exactly the opposite of what these defenders of modern scientific rationality do in practice. Which, and I just said in practice, it reminds me that I think it's worth pointing out that in my body of work, one thing I've tried to do is not just preach deconstruction, but to practice it. And unless someone understands that, they really remain clueless about what it was I was trying to accomplish with Prometheus and Atlas, not just as a text, but as a project at work in the world.
Well, I think when you talk about practicing deconstruction to people who are rationalists, that makes you dangerous. And frankly, the same people have accused me for being a spokesperson for the science of parapsychology and of being dangerous because I'm undermining what they regard as an absolute truth.
Yes, but I would say that, I mean, this article was titled something like, Aliens, Anti-Semitism, and Academia, or something like that. And so the people who are accusing me of being an anti-Semite or other even more ridiculous things don't realize just how dangerous I am. I'm considerably more dangerous than they think.
Well,
because I cannot be fit into those cupboards and categories.
No, and their desire, the desire of many different people to pin labels on you, I think is because they sense you're dangerous and they fear that you're dangerous in a bad way. My sense is that you are dangerous in a very positive way.
I affirm that I epitomize postmodernity. The difference is that I have a positive vision of the New Age.
Mm-hmm. Well, how does a positive vision of the New Age fit in with the postmodern project of deconstruction?
Well, Deleuze, one of the main thinkers of postmodernity alongside Foucault and Derrida, Deleuze disagreed with Derrida and others who adopted this idea from Heidegger of the end of philosophy, that basically what we're left with now is literary and cultural criticism, and that philosophy in any kind of classical sense has come to an end. Deleuze argues that in a book called What is Philosophy, which also influenced Prometheus and Atlas, and which I repeatedly reference, Deleuze argues in What is Philosophy that it is possible to develop postmodern philosophical concepts. As Deleuze understands it, a philosopher is someone who discovers or invents concepts. And you can know a true philosopher based on whether they've done that and whether their concepts form a constellation on what he calls a plane of consistency. In other words, they are interpenetrated and related to one another in a way that forms a certain common context of meaning. So, for example, in Nietzsche, the concept of the will to power and that of the Superman and the last man and the Antichrist are all interpenetrating and related in a certain way that's very different from the way in which variables in an equation are related. So I, in my work, have developed a number of philosophical concepts: the spectral revolution, mercurial hermeneutics, the world state of emergency, and novel folklore. And these concepts are all on a certain plane of consistency. But they're concepts that have been developed in full awareness of the deconstruction of any fundamental ontology. I think it's possible to do that, and I have been engaged in that project.
Well, where do you see it going? What do you have a vision of a future based on these concepts?
If you look at the concept of the spectral revolution or mercurial hermeneutics, my idea of where we ought to be on the other side of what I call the world state of emergency is in a world where we consider various systems of knowledge to be models rather than representations of reality, and in a world where we understand the subconscious processes that have had an archetypal force in developing our various scientific and social structures, so that we are not merely vehicles for unconscious forces that dominate our lives and result in the instrumentalization of human existence, so that we can overcome our alienation from these unconscious forces, identify with them, and use them in more constructive ways.
And I also have the opinion about your work, that one of the things you're suggesting when you refer to William James and his relationship to the philosophy of Nietzsche, that William James may have seen the project of psychical research and parapsychology as leading toward the potential development of what Nietzsche referred to as the Superman.
Absolutely. I affirm Nietzsche's prophecy of the Superman, and I think we are at that 11th hour, or maybe just before midnight, the stroke of midnight, when the last man has come to dominate on the earth. What Nietzsche called the last man has come to dominate on the earth. Entirely self-satisfied person, distracted by various forms of entertainmentism, who strives for no higher goals. the epitome of the rabble in its most sophisticated form. And Nietzsche believed that this would be the moment before the rise of the Superman and would be the trial that tested the mettle of those who would be the pioneers of this next stage in human evolution. They would be the ones who wouldn't succumb to the nihilism that the last man is a product of.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's very profound, and I know we could go on for a long time talking about how the work of deconstruction can be applied to our understanding of our own inner psyche. I hope to have many more talks with you, in fact, about that. But for now, Jason Reza Jorjani, it's been another great pleasure to have this conversation.
Likewise, Jeffrey.
Thank you for being with me,
Looking
Jason.
forward to speaking with you again.
And thank you for being with us.